Hey folks, hope you all are doing well. I'm Karan Bandal from Economist site, and in this video let's talk about what's truly ailing China. China's real problem isn't what everyone thinks it is. As the Chinese economy has begun to slow down, even according to the official Chinese data, more and more attention is being placed on China's swelling debt burden. And when you compare Chinese debt to how some of the other major economies are doing, it indeed appears troubling. How do you compare debts of different countries? Well, a meaningful metric to use here is a debt to GDP ratio, not the absolute debt figure. Because this ratio puts the debt of a nation in the context of the size of that nation's economy. A larger economy can comfortably carry a larger debt burden. Now, China's overall debt to GDP ratio has increased fourfold since the 1980s. As of 2022, it was more than the UK, the whole of European region, and was inching closer to the United States, might have even crossed the United States in 2023. So yes, Chinese debt has certainly surged, but that by itself isn't the problem but rather a symptom of the problem. Then what is it? Before we talk about what the real problem is, here's a story that provides us with an inkling of what it might be. The EU has launched a probe into the Chinese EV makers. This investigation is set to run for 13 months and will decide whether the EU imposes higher tariffs on Chinese EV companies to protect European car makers. The reason for this potential action is that in the EU, Chinese-made EVs typically sell for 20% less than those made in the EU bloc itself, and their market share is gaining serious pace. So what's wrong with selling a competitively priced product? After all, isn't the Western world all about the free market? Of course, Chinese manufacturers are extremely competitive, but experts state that the Chinese car makers receive generous state subsidies. As a result, they are churning out alarmingly inexpensive electric vehicles at a relentless pace. This is bad not only for China but also for the foreign car makers, because you end up saturating your own domestic market and then flood the foreign markets with cheaper products. China's own governing authority confirms this. These Chinese state subsidies are creating huge market distortions, compromising the free market mechanism, and that's what the EU has an issue with. So back to the question, what is the real problem ailing the Chinese economy? You can see what Michael Pettis has to say about it. He puts an emphasis on the chronic misallocation of the capital and unwillingness to recognize the losses. Simply put, over the past decade, China has been investing into the assets that do not generate enough returns to pay back even the interest on the debts used to finance the assets. And why would a nation go down this path? See, in accounting, losses associated with an asset are treated as expenses. Higher expenses push the earnings down. If the earnings fall to such levels that you cannot even service the debt, the entity goes out of business. This is what's supposed to happen in a free market. Then the entity will go into bankruptcy, where its assets will be written down, a better management will acquire that entity and hopefully run it profitably, thus converting a non-performing asset into a better one. That's how you stop the loss-making investment cycle. But you cannot stop it if the asset-related losses are never recognized. In an Indian context, we are well aware of the multi-year-long pain it caused to the Indian economy because the government was unwilling to recognize the NPAs associated with the state-owned banks. In case of China, in the last 15 odd years, the losses associated with the misallocation of the investment were capitalized instead of being recognized. It's a form of a bailout. An example in the Indian context would be, before Air India was privatized, let's say Air India incurs a loss of $3 billion in a year. Instead of cutting expenses to move towards profitability, the state-run carrier doesn't change a thing because the government bails it out by lending the airline $3 billion, no questions asked. In other words, the state has capitalized Air India's losses. This has been happening to most of the entities in China that are subject to soft budget constraints, like state-owned companies, local governments, and highly subsidized manufacturers. In the case of non-performing or poorly performing asset, if you carry the investment on the balance sheet at cost, it creates a fictitious asset, reports higher earnings, but it will not generate enough returns to service the debt. There's a reason stories related to overbuilding come out of China every so often. We have heard about the ghost towns. Then there was a recent story that came out in September 2023 that claimed China has enough vacant homes to house 3 billion people. The nation has 1.4 billion people in total. Now that the Beijing has started putting restrictions on how much debt you can take on, the soft constraints are being hardened and the reckoning is here. This asset side of the China's balance sheet is its key and an almost unmanageable problem, because addressing this problem will mean recognizing the losses that have been building up for more than a decade, with two major impacts on the economy. First, it will be politically embarrassing, because if you accurately state the assets like the infrastructure, real estate and state-owned companies, then China will have to reverse the former additions to GDP. That is, the size of the GDP will shrink. Second, the wealth effect will begin to unwind. Households and other entities that assumed they were wealthier than they actually were tended collectively to spend more than they could have otherwise afforded. Therefore, with consumer spending going down, the economy will take an even harder hit. In summary, everyone talks about China's debt as one of the few key issues that will hold them back going forward. But debt is only one side of the balance sheet. The other side is a set of assets backing that debt. This asset side has become the key issue in case of China and is also threatening foreign private players by creating distortions in the free market. But if China can address this asset problem, it will benefit not only the Chinese economy, but also the global economy at large. I hope you found this analysis interesting. I'll speak with you again next week. Until then, take care.